turn my... Oh, It's both Washington Post and the New York Times are here. Interesting. All right.
Were you trying to psych me out there?
Maybe I should not have told you that. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Welcome to Center for New American Security. My name is IIan Goldenberg. I run the Middle East Security Program here at CNAS. And today we're going to spend a couple hours talking about the future of the Middle East, and specifically, how we think about American policy in the context of, the aftermath of at least the end of the ISIS caliphate. But obviously, ISIS very much remains a factor. As we saw just last week in Sri Lanka, and also looking more broadly at the region and all the various challenges we face. We have, as part of this event, we're rolling out 2 new CNAS reports. The first, Solving the Syrian Rubik's Cube, an instruction guide for leveraging Syria's fragmentation to achieve U.S. policy objectives. We have long subtitles. That's how we like to roll here. And that was written by my colleague Nick Harris and my colleague Kaylee Thomas, and we'll have a whole panel that dives deeper on what happens, what we do next in Syria, and really looks at sort of 6 options ultimately for American policy in Syria based on the level of commitment that the United States wants to make and the level of investment the United States wants to make, as well as also looking at the question of how we want to, what kind of posture we want to take towards Bashar al-Assad. The second report, Slow and Steady, Improving U.S.-Arab Cooperation to Counter Irregular Warfare, builds on a lot of research in the past on why efforts for the United States to work together with its Arab partners have failed in this capacity, especially in dealing with the challenges posed by Salafi jihadists, and also challenges posed by Iran at sort of this below the high level conventional conflict and much more at the lower level asymmetric warfare questions. And so we'll have an opportunity also with a great panel to discuss that. But before we do any of that, we have an excellent keynote speaker here, and what we're going to do is have a little bit of a chat, myself and him. We have Mick Mulroy, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Mick runs OSD Policy Middle East, which is an office I served in for a few years, and we were talking about before, really includes everything from Egypt to Iran. One of the most important and influential, I think, offices inside OSD policy, and frankly in the U.S. government, looking at this very challenging set of questions that keeps the office incredibly busy and keeps people who work there, as I can tell you from experience, working very long hours sometimes under constant pressure and unpredictable things that come in. Mick is a retired paramilitary operations officer who used to work for the CIA. He had a number of overseas assignments during his distinguished career, a number of very senior overseas assignments. And his awards include the Intelligence Star, the Intelligence Commendation Medal, the Career Intelligence Medal, and the National Intelligence Exceptional Achievement Medal, among others. So obviously he's somebody who knows how to work and deal with challenges in conflict regions, and in some of the challenges facing the Middle East. He was really a perfect person for this type of position. With that, welcome, Mick. Great to have you here. I'll start by asking you a question, really at the meta level, which is to say, talking about the Middle East in Washington seems a little passé these days now. Everything's about great power competition. It's about the national defense strategy. It's about shifting to China and Russia. But we still have real interests in the Middle East. We can't give those up. And how do we think about those? And how do you think about, the overall region and how you try to protect American interests in this environment where it looks like or at least there's a lot of debate about potentially pulling back?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me, Elon, and thanks for everybody else that came out today. I think we're talking about the Middle East. We should probably start with, as you already referenced, the National Defense Strategy, which, as you know, came from the National Security Strategy, which is issued in 2017, and then the next year we had the NDS, the National Defense Strategy. It does, as you mentioned, prioritize Russia and China as our near-peer competitors, the North Korea and Iran as rogue state actors, and then lastly, our priorities is now counterterrorism. So I would say a few things. It's not the first time that we've tried to pull away from the Middle East in counterterrorism. 2001, obviously before the 9/11 attacks, and then 2011. But that's the priorities, and we are committed to implementing in that order. When it comes to the Middle East, though, Russia and China actually play a very active part in the Middle East. So part of the dialogue we're trying to inject into this is it's not just geographic. In other words, if you're going to send resources just to geographic regions, that might not be the most effective way to push back against the influence of Russia and China, particularly if they're building bases in Africa and the Middle East. But specifically toward Iran, and I know you wanted me to focus on that. The threats that we look at that come from Iran primarily exist in five spheres. The first one is the concern that they would get a nuclear weapon, the first one. We obviously have plans to prevent that from happening, and the president's been fully clear in his intent not to let that happen. The second part is the maritime security, which for folks that are familiar with the region, you have the Straits of Hormuz and you have the Bab el-Mandeb. A substantial portion of our energy trade and commercial goods period go through those straits. The Iranians are constantly threatening those. We, of course, have plans to make sure that that doesn't happen, and we keep those trade routes open. The third threat, and Secretary Mattis used to hold his hands up while he did this, five of them, is their support to proxies and terrorist organizations. So I know we're going to go more into detail on that, but that would include Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis, some of the Hashd al-Shaabi units in Iraq, and of course they're housing and safe harboring senior al-Qaeda leaders. So those are other issues that I'm sure we'll get into. The fourth one is the ballistic missile threat, which we see emanating from areas of Houthi control in Yemen toward our allies in Saudi Arabia, which there's a substantial amount of American citizens present. And then, of course, on the border with Israel, all the advanced weapon systems that they have there and their spread is of high concern. And then the last one I'd point out is cyber. Cyber is something that comes up in literally every discussion about anything now. From my perspective, having started my career in the agency right around the time of September 11th, CT was something that was very, and I don't know. Yeah, okay, it's working. And then we figured out how to work together as interagencies. I see that happening now in cyber, is why I bring that up. We have somebody specifically dedicated to cyber, so it's not me. But I see that kind of the growing page that is going through right now with us on that.
Sure. So maybe just to dive a little bit deeper on Iran, and part of the, I don't want to get into a long discussion on the nuclear question. I really want to focus on the regional question, which is the one that I think many in the region focus on. Even if from the American perspective, I think the nuclear still remains, the first and foremost global priority. But on the regional question, one of the things that we talk about in one of our reports, especially on the Arab irregular warfare report, is we've had one administration after another come in and say, and both Democrats and Republicans, and say, we're going to push back against Iranian behavior in the region. We're going to figure out how to deter. We're going to, stop their, use of militias. But, hasn't really worked thus far. It's a pretty cheap tool. And it's one they've been, able to use pretty effectively in places like Iraq against us, places like Syria, where they've been hugely supportive of Bashar al-Assad, in places like Yemen to some extent. And so, what can we actually do to be more effective against this challenge? How are you guys thinking about that?
So we can get into the maximum pressure campaign that's run by the State Department, but I'd start with the way that the DoD approaches the problem, which is largely in four bins. The first one's plans. We are, as a CIA person, I was uber impressed with how much the military plans for everything, and Iran's no exception. So there are plans to do essentially everything: defend our key allies, to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons, from opening the Straits of Hormuz, and obviously responding to any kind of aggression. And that's continuous. And General Votel spent a lot of time on that, and General McKenzie, his replacement down at Central Command, is also dedicated to that. The next one I would say is, and I know we're going to get into MESA, the Middle East Strategic Alliance, is building partnerships, because that's what the NDS essentially requires us to do, to build up our partnerships. And I'll save most of the discussion on that for that. Our posture, we have bases throughout the Middle East. We are on bases with our key allies throughout the Middle East. That limits the Iranian freedom of movement. It protects the key straits, the key choke points of maritime trade. And it's very important in that regard. I know we get a lot of questions, so I'll go ahead and answer one of them. We are committed to the NDS. The NDS does prioritize Russia and China, and any strategy that prioritizes should allocate resources accordingly. So there is a shifting of resources. But the one thing I would add to that is the United States is by far the most capable when it comes to expeditionary warfare and the ability to project power anywhere in the world to great effect. So that and our what we call dynamic force employment, where we routinely have forces show up in an area that may not be expected, shows our ability to do that. So when it comes to shifting forces, that's something that we do to make up for it.
Yeah, and something we always used to, when I was at DoD, we used to try to remind ourselves, working on the Iran problem in particular, that the Iranians are not 10 feet tall. Like, we're still quite capable of doing a lot of different things at once. I want to shift us a little bit to Syria and Iraq, because that's another one of the focuses, especially of the report that Nick and Kaylee put out, which I think will actually officially come out, I think, while we're all sitting here at some point this afternoon. But we've had the defeat of the caliphate itself, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about where things go in Syria and in Iraq going forward. And so how are you guys thinking about this now? What are you most worried about and concerned about? Is it Syria, is it Iraq? How are you thinking about long-term American presence in a place like Iraq and Syria? Maybe you can walk us through the latest in terms of what DoD and the administration are considering as they look at these questions.
Yeah, and I would agree with your paper that the model that we used in Syria is a good model for future activities. Essentially, a relatively small contingent of U.S. forces paired with a very capable and willing partner, in this case the Syrian Defense Forces, supported and enabled by our air support, our combat advisors, and our combat logistics, which is actually sometimes the most important part of the partnership as far as our support, paired with a diplomatic effort, which was Brett McGurk and Bill Roebuck, and now it's Jim Jeffrey and Joel Rayburn. So paired with them, and then followed eventually by stabilization. I know we have a whole section on that, and I'd love to get into it. But I would highlight that is a good model, and it's not the only time we've used that. At the beginning of Afghanistan with the Northern Alliance, small groups of special forces and CIA officers, and then in Iraq, essentially the same model with the Kurdish Peshmerga that did Operation Viking Hammer at the beginning of the war and then became the Northern Front against Saddam. So that model is very effective, and I think that is something to be highlighted. On the good part of it, 40,000 square miles were liberated, 10 million people were pulled out of the grip of ISIS, and that is something I think we should really highlight. However, there's no victory dances going on at the Pentagon. We lost 14 people in that fight. Our SDF partners have told us they've lost 11,000. The UN estimates up to 400,000 Syrians died, and 5.5 million people fled. So it is a good thing that ISIS no longer controls territory, but there was a lot of cost that I think would subdue any type of celebration necessarily. Some of the things the lessons learned, I think, that came out of this and that we'll deal with going ahead, and something we're still dealing with is the foreign terrorist fighters. So we have a non-state actors with limited resources that has over 1,000 foreign terrorist fighters that come from 50 different countries. I don't think the international community should sit on the sidelines and just watch them deal with this. I think there's a responsibility of the international community to step up and take their citizens back. So that's one thing that I definitely, I don't know if that's necessarily lessons learned, but it's certainly something that I think is important.
Yeah, and in terms of, way forward, especially, I'd say, well, both, maybe also talking about Iraq and the way forward in Iraq.
Right.
How do you see that? Obviously, we have a pretty challenging situation, but also one where, at least where I pull back, I sort of look at Iraq and I say, this is, in some ways, this is kind of a good news story. Yes, it's complicated. It's hard. We got Iranian influence. You have American influence. There's a lot of competition going on. You have the Gulf states increasingly re-engaging. How are you guys? I know DoD spends a lot of time thinking about long-term stability of Iraq. What are you thinking there in terms of and how you're engaging with the Iraqi government?
Yeah, and I'll take part of your last question and this question, because you asked me what we worry about the most. And I think it's important to note that the physical caliphate is defeated, but ISIS is not. So there's upwards around 10,000 ISIS fighters and support elements within Syria and Iraq, and they are completely unrepentant. And that's something that we intend to or expect to deal with for many years to come. So this is transition to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. But I would say that in a way that doesn't minimize how important that is, because it's not going away. And also Idlib. Idlib is essentially the largest collection of Al Qaeda affiliates in the world right now. We have very limited insights into what's going on. It is, to your question, something we worry about a great deal. Specifically to Iraq, a lot of us in the DoD and my former organization spent a lot of time in Iraq building up their security forces, and I think they can be proud of the effort that went into that. They especially the counterterrorism service, just to highlight one in particular, has really proven that effort was worth it, and they've spent a considerable amount of time ridding their country with our support, but they did it of ISIS. Long-term stability, I think it's important that we're there. I think our presence in Iraq is hugely significant and one of the biggest factors when it comes to U.S. influence in the Middle East. And we're there alongside the GOI. We're there at their request from the Strategic Framework Agreement we signed 10 years ago. So I think we are part of that. I think we are part of ensuring that their military and their security services are capable of defending the sovereignty of the government of Iraq.
And you think also in Syria, would you say the same thing? You think we're there and at this point looking at a long-term continued commitment to try to maintain the stability there?
Right. And this is something that Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who is our special envoy for Syria, says a lot. We're not in a bad situation there. I know that's a strange thing to say considering this, everything that's gone on in Syria, but we have a very capable partner. They have the territory that controls a lot of the oil resources and the arable land for agriculture. And we are there with them. And we do expect to be there for the long haul. And our presence, although military presence is only there to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, it does provide our diplomats influence, right? When they are, because we have several objectives in Syria, only one of them is defeat of ISIS, but when it comes to pushing for the UN Resolution 2254, that process to go forward, which Ambassador Jeffrey is at the helm, having us there, both in the Northeast and down in Antonov Garrison, does provide them leverage. When it comes to pushing back against the Iranian-controlled militias that are in Syria with that really have a threat to a lot of our allies, our presence is not there for that, but our presence does allow us a lot of influence when it comes to dealing with the consequences.
Sure. So I wanted to shift again as we're doing this tour of the region. And I know Yemen is an area that you focused on a lot yourself, and you've been there a number of times. And so, maybe you can tell, obviously Yemen is an issue that in Washington gets a lot of attention. And there's, a lot of concern in Congress about, the Saudi-led campaign, as well as, I think, concern that, quite frankly, that the American administration has given the Saudis almost a concern, a blank check to do what they'd like in Yemen, which has been problematic. But I wonder what your assessment is of the current situation there, from your trips there, and sort of how we're trying to approach this with our Arab partners.
Yeah, that's correct. I do spend a lot of time on Yemen, and I think as a short aside, I am in this position because they were looking for somebody who had spent a lot of time in conflict areas. So if I have a specialty, that's actually it. It was they were looking for an apolitical person to do that. So my travel schedule kind of relates to that. So I've spent a lot of time in Syria, in Iraq, and the Egyptian Sinai, and Yemen. And I just was in Yemen last week. So a couple of points on that. We support UNSCR 2216, as you would expect, 100%. The only answer for Yemen is a peaceful solution and an end to the conflict that's caused such a tremendous humanitarian problem there. Secretary Mattis, myself, my team has a very strong relationship with the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffith. We support him and his team, particularly Lieutenant General Losgaard, who is the man on the ground in Hudaydah. They are pushing for the Stockholm Agreement to be implemented. I think a lot of us would have liked to see that happen faster, and there's a lot of concern that the Houthis, quite frankly, haven't lived up to their agreements that they made specifically in Stockholm. But they keep pushing, and we hope that they see that it's in their best interest to relieve the stress that's in Hudaydah, make sure that there's never a cutting off of humanitarian aid that goes through that main port into the northern parts of the country. I would say we certainly spent a lot of time discussing the issues with the Saudi-led coalition, and I'll talk a little bit about CT, but we'll start with Houthi issues. The Houthis are supported by Iran. They provide them weapons. We have a Iran material display right here in one of our bases, if you ever want to get to it. There's analysts that specialize in it. They can explain exactly why we know they come from Iran. But we're very confident and clear that that's what's going on. They also provide funds and oil. But the concerns on the Hill, there's basically two pieces of legislation that we've been up there to brief them on. The first one is the War Powers Resolution, the Senator Sanders and Senator Lee. That's specifically about U.S. not being involved in combat operations. We don't think we are involved in combat operations. We don't refuel aircraft anymore. We stopped that last year. The only thing we do now is essentially side-by-side coaching to help mitigate civilian casualties, teach them our techniques to basically strike who you're going after and not strike who you don't want to, so obviously innocent civilians. And enforce the law of armed conflict to push for real investigations that lead to real change. That's all that's left that we do. If you look at that legislation or the Saudi Accountability and Yemeni Act, I don't think this is their intent, but if that should pass in a level that's above the veto, then essentially all they would cut off is our coaching them, the Saudi-led coalition, try to avoid civilian casualties. I'm sure that's not what they intend, but I don't see, that's the way I see it. I see that if that happens, that is obviously not helping the situation.
So do you think there's things that we could do with the Saudis that would try to improve the situation, or at least lead to a better outcome or approach to how they're dealing with the conflict? Or maybe it sort of starts to lean into the next question in our second report, which really talks about how we work more effectively with our Arab partners.
So first I would like to continue our efforts to work in their joint force command. We have Americans there working side by side. But what I would like to highlight is the need to start focusing on the Yemeni people. The Yemeni people are moving out with everything that they need to do to try to take their country from a failed state to, say, a fragile state, which is obviously a move in the right direction. When I was in Aden, I met with a new prime minister who has just been appointed and endorsed by the parliament. I met with most of his staff. It's the first time I met him, but I would say my impressions are highly motivated people who really want to do the right thing for their country. They want to start building their own security forces, both the border, both Coast Guard and local security forces, to prevent the flow of weapons into their country and obviously secure the population. I met with the Civil Action group that literally came from all over the country, some driving for 2 days, to talk about what they want to see done in their country. And I think their voice needs to be more heard. We're also, and this is something that was started by the previous secretary, working with the UN on a comprehensive plan that would look how to assist the people of Yemen by building an international plan, a comprehensive plan that focuses on economic development, political grassroots efforts, local political efforts, and building up the Yemeni security forces. And we spent a lot of time trying to get funding to do just that. And that's something that really hope will take shape.
So I want to sort of pivot us to one more topic that I want to dive into. Working okay? All right. And which is working with our Arab partners, which we sort of mentioned too. And I mean, one of the things we found, one of the reasons we undertook the second report was because our experience has been that there's a lot of struggles and a lot of challenges with trying to be, with all these different challenges, whether it's Syria or Iraq or Yemen, these different conflict zones. The role of the U.S. military working together with Arab militaries has been mixed at best. And, I was there, I was at DOD 10 years ago, and we were trying to get, our Gulf partners to coordinate more effectively on missile defense and maritime security and counterterrorism and all these things. And we're still trying to basically do that. And so I'd be interested to get, your take on, we now have this Middle East Strategic Alliance. That's the latest initiative. But it's another effort, like similar efforts that have been tried in the past. I'm curious to get your take on how well that is going, what you guys are trying to do, and what kind of success you think you can have.
Yeah, and to your point, this isn't the first time it's been tried, and there's a reason behind it because it's important. So the Middle East Strategic Alliance, from our perspective, from the U.S. perspective, we want this to be a holistic agreement. And by that I mean we want an economic part, we want an energy part, we want a political part, we want a security part. I fully recognize there's challenges in many of those. I mean, if you start off with the political part, we currently have a rift, specifically with Qatar. So that has to be addressed. Economically, there are diverse economies. There's a lot of pre-existing agreements, and we don't intend any of those to be superseded by Mesa. But specifically on the security point, and I can see Ken Pollock's here. We started off our part by actually having Ken come in and talk about his book, Armies of Sand. So we took a very realistic approach to what we were doing, I'd like to highlight. But we do think we've made progress. I would focus on 3 areas that we're really going to focus on when it comes to building these parts. The first one's capabilities. And they're very similar to the Secretary's 5 fingers here, but we're going to build a center where we teach best practices when it comes to maritime, air defense, border, cyber, asymmetric warfare, and then command and control. And they're going to be spread throughout the regions. We're going to look for places that we've already have infrastructure. This isn't about spending more money. This is about us being in a role of facilitator and instructor, and the countries themselves adding to the and basically it's their expense. I'd also say that the next thing that we're going to focus on, and it is very consistent, I would say, with your paper, at least the security part. So I don't know if that means you need to change your ideas, but we're actually lined up pretty well.
That's actually good to hear, not bad to hear.
All right. So the common picture, I'd say the second one. So when it comes to joint strategy, identifying the threats, for example. So right now, the threats are Salafi jihadists, as you call them, terrorists, and the proxies of the Iranians. But it is important to point out that this is not an alliance to counter Iran. This is an alliance to defend ourselves, and that's the current threat. It could change in the future. Also, I'd say it requires a collective effort, and that's their third pillar. We need to have the ability to talk to each other, so interoperability, which still isn't completely fixed in NATO, for example. And we need to have common munitions, weapons, and we need to have the ability to actually work together. Specific to NATO, since this question's brought up, it is not the Arab NATO. There is no intent to turn this into an Article 5 type situation where we have a treaty and required to defend. This is an attempt to work together with our GCC +2 Egypt and Jordan partners to make them more effective, so we can best defend ourselves and stabilize the region.
So I was going to follow up with you on one more question on this, which is just to say, I guess one of the things that where we, at least where we focused on in terms of our report was to start small and build bigger. We really try to emphasize the fact that, if you paint it as a huge picture, if you paint it as Middle East NATO, you're going to get almost nowhere. But the other challenge is also, and I'm curious to your take on this, and I think it'll probably be my last question because we'll have to move on, and we also know you're a busy guy who's got a lot of other things to do. But the biggest challenge in some ways is not the capabilities sometimes, and it's not even, agreeing on a threat picture. It's almost just the politics, like you said, and you referenced yourself. The politics of, for example, division between Qatar and the other Gulf states, or even, threat perceptions where, some countries view, like Saudi Arabia would view Iran as the single most important challenge in the region. But others, like Egypt, are much more concerned with, for example, Salafist jihadist threat. And even defining, there's different definitions of whether you are okay with the Muslim Brotherhood or you are not okay with the Muslim Brotherhood, and different countries have different views on that. So how do you navigate all of that when you're trying to do this?
Yeah, and I think those are all good points, and that's largely in the economic and political, and that's something that, obviously from DoD, we support our State Department colleagues when they try to work through it, but I don't think there's going to be any answers, any easy answers, I should say, but I do think that we can eventually land on the need to defend ourselves and to have the ability to do that together, so that, as you mentioned, integrated missile defense is something we've been talking about a long time, and it benefits everybody. So from that perspective, I think there will be some commonalities that we can agree on. I do agree with the premise, and you brought it up because it was in one of your papers, that focusing small, and that's kind of my background as a paramilitary officer, but focusing on elite units that you can really make capable, competent, and of a caliber of unit that we would like to work with, which includes human rights and accountability. It's much easier to do when you do that at a small level. And examples you used, I would agree with. The Magawer Regiment in Lebanese Armed Forces. There was a great effort done in Afghanistan with NDS and the CTPTs. And those are examples, and I think that will probably be part of any efforts going forward when it comes to efforts like Syria or in Mesa.
Yeah, and I should also say that, we heavily referenced Ken Pollock's book when making those recommendations.
You didn't ask me to do that either.
Well, he'll be talking about it later. But Mick, thank you very much for taking this time with us. And I would like everybody to just say a thank you to Mick Mulroy, and then we'll move on to our next panel. Thank you. So we're going to bring up